Your reaction to this move by Trump's lawyers?
Well, it's a move engendered to come up with as much delay as is possible. It's not about the substance. The D.C. Circuit basically shredded the opinion, the contentions of the Trump lawyers, really kind of gave it the back of the hand. And I think what is a really comprehensive and well-done opinion, my hope would be that the Supreme Court will look at the nature of what was raised, which I think is pretty frivolous, and the comprehensive nature of that opinion, and not take the case. But the purpose of the filing is simply to delay the proceedings.
And so this is one of those times where the court could take the case, reject Donald Trump's entire arguments and theory of an autocratic presidency, but delay the thing so long that it would, as a practical matter, help him. Should the justices think about that sort of reverse outcome?
I think so. I mean, you know, you can't look at it in a vacuum. I mean, say, well, maybe the Supreme Court should make a decision on a case that is of first impression, and I can understand that argument to some extent. On the other hand, if you look at the oral argument, if you look at the opinion that was written by the D.C. Circuit, you see that there is no substance to those claims. And if you have to do a bit of balancing here, I think on the part of the Supreme Court, making sure that the American people have a vital piece of information before them, and that is the guilt or innocence of a proposed president, that I think outweighs the notion of doing something that is of first impression.
You say first impression. That's the idea that some arguments are so important because the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on them yet, and we all understand this is new because no other president's gotten himself indicted.
No other president's ever said that I am totally above the law. We've had disputes about, you know, what's the reach of the civil law when it comes to a president. No president has ever said I'm above the criminal law. And the D.C. Circuit, in a very comprehensive opinion, kind of step by step, looked at all of the contentions that they raised and dismissed them.
So I have a very legalistic question for you, but it's fitting. If you were teaching your Solicitor General, as you oversaw that department that talks to the Supreme Court, or a law student, where is the tension between first impression, you just explained why sometimes that means the court should take it, and dangerous, or what I call bananas arguments? The fact that the argument of first impression here is one we've never heard before is partly a demerit. No former president, even Nixon, claimed this level of powers. It was quite literally described as a license to kill. Should that cut against it? Otherwise, any politician can say it's first impression. No one's ever said something this extreme before.
Yeah, I mean, if the Supreme Court had an unlimited amount of time, I think it might be a good thing for the court to say, you know, we're going to put a nail in the heart of this kind of argument. But they don't have an unlimited amount of time. We do have an election that will happen in the beginning of November. And I think when you have on file now a D.C. Circuit opinion that I think will stand the test of time as a guide for future litigants, future presidents who might want to raise the same things that Donald Trump has. I'm not sure there's a need for a Supreme Court opinion here, even though it is a matter of first impression.
Yeah, very interesting coming from you, and I know how seriously you take this stuff. You may or may not remember because you're busy, but you sat at this table when the Mueller report first started to come out. And you said, as a legal matter, the prosecutor, and I checked this today, you said, quote, cleared the president of Russian collusion, the idea that there might have been a criminal charge around that alleged activity, which there was not, and you described it as thus. Now we have this special counsel, Hur, who has not found basis for any charge, hypothetically or otherwise, clearing President Biden. And yet in that report, as you know, he writes, Biden is, however, quote, an elderly man with a poor memory, that in Mr. Hur's, I guess, lay, non-expert medical opinion, he thinks Biden has, quote, diminished faculties, no footnote for that, and, quote, Biden did not remember when his son Beau died, an extemporaneous comment that doesn't seem legally relevant in which the president and his lawyers have strenuously rebutted. Your assessment of both the findings of this report and whether that was out of bounds?
Well, it seems to me that based on the evidence that has been adduced, that the findings are correct, that in fact there's no basis to charge the president with a crime. But the language surrounding those findings, I think, a lot of it was gratuitous and not based, as best I can tell, on anything that was relevant to their conclusions.
Does that raise questions then about the goal? Because you've handled and overseen a lot of cases, and I'll just remind everyone, you could charge or you could not charge. You have a declination. That's it. Yeah. Now, do you usually see in a declination the then public release of material, say, about that person's deceased son or their discussion of it?
No, you don't usually see that, but this is a little different in the sense that he's a special counsel working under regulations that require a report be filed. But even with those special circumstances, the language that he used and the focus that he put on certain matters, I think is out of bounds. I don't need to know about what the president knew or did not know. I'm not saying that he did not know, when Beau Biden died, but what's the relevance of that to his retention of classified documents? If you look at the Pence special prosecutor, no one even kind of remembers that case because that guy, I think it was a guy, did it by the book. He looked at the case, made a determination that there was no violation, filed a report as such, and it just went away.
Let me ask you this. Does this call Special Counsel Hurd's credibility into question?
Well, I think he's either extremely naive or he is a partisan. I read in the newspapers that apparently the lawyers for President Biden had the ability to raise with him, and did raise with him, concerns about the use of the language. So this had to be something in his mind that he was thinking, well, all right, somebody's raised an objection and how this will be viewed politically, if not legally, and he nevertheless went ahead. So as I said, he is either unbelievably naive or, unfortunately, partisan.
We've gotten to talk sometimes over the years. I don't know how you feel now, but I sometimes feel that we are living through strange times. The prior president did not do much to cooperate with the special counsel probe. And we should mention, in fairness to President Trump, there are defenses and mechanisms that the president can use. Bill Clinton did a limited testimony. From what we can tell, President Biden did the most fulsome testimony we've seen of any recent president in a long time. Definitely more so than the last several, including Bush, who did a non-under oath interview for the Libby leak. So, on the one hand, he cooperates extensively. Then, as mentioned, on the criminal question, he's cleared. But he comes out the same day of the public release of the report and sounds off. And many people I could think could understand emotionally where he's coming from. But what I say is strange is full cooperation and then sounds off. Take a listen to what the president said.
I know there's some attention paid to some language in the report about my recollection of events. There's even reference that I don't remember when my son died. How in the hell dare he raise that? Frankly, when I was asked the question, I thought to myself, it wasn't any of their damn business.
Your assessment of that, and was he within his bounds to respond this way?
Yeah, I think he was totally within bounds. I mean, he's talking about the death of his son. He's talking about the death of his boy. That was a father reacting to an assertion that he didn't know when his son died. I'd be just as, and I'm going to say it, just as pissed off as he was if somebody said something like that to me. My dad died in 1998, 2 days ago, and if I'm under pressure, if I'm in the middle of, I think, 2 days of examination, if I'm dealing with the Israeli crisis, the Gaza crisis as he was, that might be a date that I might forget. I'm not saying that he did forget, but if he did, that is something that in some ways is understandable. But the larger question is, why the hell are you asking that question?
Right.
What does that have to do with the retention of classified documents? Again, as I said, I'd like to think that at best, this prosecutor was extremely naive, a rube perhaps, but I worry that at some level of his consciousness, he's a Republican appointee, and he's thinking, I want to have a life beyond what I'm saying in connection with this investigation, and that might have shaded what he put in the report.
Look, people are going to make up their own minds. That's the best part of this country. But you've been known to be fair and pretty crisp on these matters. I mentioned what you said when the Mueller report came out. You saying he's either a rube, an idiot, or letting partisan motivations infect this is quite a statement. And this goes to how the Attorney General has operated. And you could tell us more than most what a tough job it is, but there's been increasing concerns, some even come in the Biden White House, about Attorney General Garland. I'll show the prosecutors that he's put in place, because he had Jack Smith come in, but relatively late. Then you have the Biden case, as mentioned. He put a special counsel for that. Special counsel for Hunter Biden. Menendez, a Democratic senator, no special counsel, although, you could have one. I'll remind viewers, you have a background in handling the public integrity section, which is what these highly sensitive cases. Number one, has Attorney General Garland relied on too many special counsels? And does the Biden case raise any questions about that? And number two, do you give him an A overall, or do you think there are concerns about his record at this point?
I think that Merrick Garland's done a good job. It's an easy thing for people on the outside to say, well, you should have done this, you should have done that. He has to deal with a number of things. He's got to deal with a political reality that, unfortunately, an attorney general now has to confront. It wasn't like that, in the old days. But I saw that start to grow with Janet Reno's time as attorney general, and I was the deputy attorney general. And there has been an increasing amount of pressure, political pressure, brought to bear on an attorney general. And that you just have to kind of push back to the extent that you can. But you also want to make sure that the American people have faith in you as an attorney general and also in the Justice Department. You want to look fair as best you can. So I think that Merrick has made the right calls with regard to the appointment of special counsels in the appropriate cases. My hope would be that once these special counsels get this power, that they use it appropriately, and I don't think that Mr. Hur has.
The structural issues in our democracy, and you, with former President Obama, have been leading on that for a long time. One example, Supreme Court here looking at the South Carolina Republicans in a case that's been described as racial gerrymandering. NBC News says Supreme Court backs landmark voting rights law, strikes down the Alabama case. So you got a bunch of these cases running around, and as you have identified, among other things, there's not only the political shamelessness to deny people votes, which has got a long history in this country, but the technology actually makes it even easier to do. Tell us about what you're doing on that front.
Right. We formed up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee back in January of 2017 to really get at this problem of racial and partisan gerrymandering. It's not the, sexiest topic in the world. It deals with the infrastructure of our democracy, and yet it's really important. If you care about a woman's right to choose, if you care about climate, if you care about criminal justice reform, protecting the right to vote, all of this depends on who serves in state legislatures, who serves in the United States House of Representatives, and lines have been drawn in such a way over time that take into account partisan issues, racial issues, and draw lines in such a way that one party is favored over another. After the redistricting that happened in 2011, which Princeton University said was the most gerrymandered of the past 50 years, we saw a decade of Republican-dominated state legislatures that had representation out of proportion to the number of votes that those Republican legislators got. And so we said, let's take this on. Let's simply try to make the system more fair. Because it's my belief that if the system is fair, just fair, Democrats, progressives will do just fine. And so we have been filing lawsuits. We have tried to energize the American people. We have put in place reform measures, independent commissions to draw the lines instead of state legislatures.
Well, wouldn't independent commissions just be the fairest thing writ large?
I think exactly right.
Instead of having politicians pick their own map or their own voters.
Right. That I think is the gold standard and is the thing that I am really committed to trying to do in as many places as we can. And I think that differentiates us from those Republican critics who will say, well, Holder's just trying to do something for Democrats. They will never stand for the creation of these independent commissions, which I think is the best way to do the whole redistricting process.
Yeah. So I got the good news and the bad news. What do you want first?
The good news.
The good news is you have been leading on these criminal justice reform issues for a long time, and I want to play the first time we ever sat down for an interview, which was now over a decade ago, because you were working on that, and we went to a veterans court that took a very simple idea. What if someone has served their country as a veteran and they have a nonviolent offense? Can't there be some other alternative to just throwing them immediately into prison? And that actually had some bipartisan support. The bad news is I want to show a clip of the interview where we talk about something that was one of the enduring criticisms of your tenure, and maybe it's not about you. Maybe it's about the system. Okay. But this idea that the bankers and the financial elites get away with everything. And I've looked back over this in preparation for this interview. Some of the noise around you at the time doesn't hold up. Particularly some of the clashes with the Congress, particularly, there was a whole meltdown because you said, America's got to face its real problems with race. And people said all sorts of things about you. And then we got MAGA, and I don't think that speech looks like anything. But the way that the bankers and the financial elites seem to get away with everything every time is an enduring issue. So the good news, the bad news all together. Let's take a look.
All right.
You're one of the ninth longest serving attorney general.
Is that right?
That is right.
I didn't know. Okay. All right.
There's been discussion in the economic realm that some institutions are either too big to indict or too big to really deal with in a criminal context.
Let me make this very clear. There are no institutions that are too big to indict.
So you said that, but most of these institutions and many of their leaders seem to get away no matter what. Preet Bharara, who worked for you, has said in New York the same thing you've said, which is it has to do with the law. So now that you're out of government, do these laws need to be strengthened and tightened, or do you think the United States, long term, including your tenure, is getting it right when so many Americans feel like, boy, they get in a lot of trouble if they're behind on the rent, or they get evicted, or a million things, and these bankers just walk?
Yeah, I mean, it is a perception that I think is not necessarily accurate, but that does not necessarily mean that there shouldn't be changes made to our laws. Just before I left as Attorney General, I gave a speech at NYU where I detailed about 5 or 6 things that could be put in place to make it easier for prosecutions to occur. I mean, people need to understand something. If we could have brought cases against the head of the largest banks, we would have brought those cases. I mean, these are career-defining cases for the prosecutors who would have brought them, for the Attorney General.
That's what Mr. Bharara said. So when you reference the speech you gave, though, that means that Congress actually could be tougher on this.
Yeah, I mean, among other things that I said, you should incentivize people who are within these institutions to share information and reward them financially in the same way we do with the False Claims Act.
But something that we've talked about before, and I know you're passionate about, is, for example, there are these felony murder laws where someone can be in a car and a crime can happen over there. And not only are they charged, they're charged for the taking of the life over there. Now, we understand why that's important, even if that sounds very severe. Is there anything like felony murder liability at the banks?
Not really. I mean, there are, accomplice laws. There's a variety of ways, conspiracy laws that can bring in people who play a minimal role, but nevertheless an important role.
Because, again, I only mean to interrupt to get to it. We hear a lot about, you guys couldn't meet the individual criminal intent, which I get, because banks are complex organizations, and they deliberately obscure. But what about having a law that says you ought to know better, and you're going to be on the hook to some degree if you see all this money coming in and all this other shenanigans, and it doesn't look right? You got to have some. You're not a random person. You're a financial professional.
No, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things I talked about was kind of a Sarbanes-Oxley criminal component, where you look at what happens in corporate America, what you look at happens in financial institutions, and come up with statutes that are designed specifically to deal with those issues. I think there is a way in which we can make our laws stronger and bring to justice greater numbers of people who are involved in these financial frauds. And it's important that we do so, because we can't have this notion that there is a two-tiered justice system. I laugh at that when I hear Donald Trump and his supporters talk about a two-tiered system of justice. That's not even close to the truth. But the reality is that, in fact, there is some basis to think that if you are a person of color or poor, you're treated differently than somebody who is white and rich.